Welcome, Andrew. It's so good to have you here. I wanted to start by talking about Rumi a little bit. Rumi's been such an important figure in your life and in your work. And what you say about him is that he is an initiator into the sacred, which, of course, is something that can be said about you, too. But that he combines the experience of divine beauty and mystery with a sober, humble teaching about how to sustain, deepen, and integrate them with daily life. How do we have that vision of the divine while integrating it into our earthbound, humble daily lives?
Well, that is the great challenge. It's a huge thing to be graced by the vision of God. It's a huge thing to have the heart be shattered open to the glory and the beauty of the divine and to see the light burning in and as everything. But after enlightenment comes the laundry, as Jack Cornfield so beautifully said. So how do we really, really bring the light down into our minds, into our hearts, into our bodies, and how do we allow what we learn from the divine experience about tenderness, about compassion, to really infuse our daily living? That is the question. I was interviewing the Dalai Lama on the day that he won the Nobel Prize in Oslo, and we had 2 hours together in an amazing, sleek white room in some dreary Oslo hotel. And at the end of the interview, I was so overwhelmed by his presence that I couldn't get out of the chair. So His Holiness came up and said, "Andrew, I have to go and get the Nobel Prize now." And he hoisted me up, and I found myself breast to breast with the Buddha of compassion. So I looked up at him and I said, "Well, we'll never be in this position again. What is the meaning of life?" And he roared with laughter, and then he became extremely serious, and he said, the meaning of life is to embody the transcendent. And he made a very powerful noise when he said, embody. And he waved his hand up and down my body, and I felt this flame rise and fall in my body, which, of course, put me into an extraordinarily fragile state, because it's not often that you're breast to breast with the Dalai Lama and he gives you the secret of life. And then he actually embodied what he said, because he said to me, "Look, you see the door? It's 50 yards away. It was a long room. We will walk towards it quietly together." And he took my hand like a mother, and he held my hand so tenderly. And he went to the door with me, and he stroked my hand and very gently let it go and said, "Goodbye, my son." And he stood in that corridor outside his room, watching me stumble down. And I turned, and all I could see really was golden light blazing from him and his face smiling so sweetly. So he hadn't just given me the secret. He was showing me how it's lived. And how it's lived must be that we really do 3 things. First, we make sacred practice the core of our lives. So many people smuggle in practice, but there comes a stage on the path when you really get that you have absolutely no hope of aligning yourself with your deepest knowledge of God unless you do the humble, daily, down-home practice. Because what practice is tuning the dial of the radio of your scattered, chaotic, ordinary self to this pure transmission from the Transcendent, so that it can flow with you throughout your day and give you space, so that whatever you do and whoever you meet, you're meeting in a state of brimming, tender calm and can radiate from that ordinary sweetness. It's amazing what happens when you really, really practice, because your whole life becomes so much gentler, and you become so much gentler, and you look at people with soft eyes, and you notice things that you would never notice, flowers coming up through the crack of the pavement, the beautiful look of old people, dogs. It's extraordinary, and you can go on and on about it, but people don't believe you until they do it. It's the way of staying aligned, staying tuned. The second thing that you really have to do, unfortunately, is to constantly work on your shadow. I, of course, have no remaining shadows, but as you know, but the more you do shadow work, of course, the more you discover how all-pervasive and destructive and folly-ridden your shadow is, and that keeps you humble, and that keeps you knowing that whatever you've learned in your divine experience, you have to constantly work on your human traumatized self for that experience to become truly integrated. And shadow work is very important because without it, you will be secretly tortured by massive self-righteousness. With it, you realize you're just another inmate of the vast lunatic asylum that is the world. And that gives you compassion and the skillful means to deal with other people's pain, other people's craziness, other people's savagery, without being terrified by that or without rushing to beat them over the head or rushing to judge them. And that is a huge liberation. Mm-hmm. The third thing that I think is absolutely essential for truly integrating the divine is to turn up as what I call a sacred activist. I've spent the last 20 years honing a vision of sacred activism, and for me, sacred activism is a marriage of the deepest spiritual awareness, the deepest spiritual peace and passion and stamina and strength, with a clear, wise commitment to action on behalf of human beings and sentient beings. So it's essential, I think, to look beyond the territory of your personal self and choose a mission, choose something that you can truly serve with your powers, with your resources, and discover the great secret that all the sages have talked about, which is that you cannot hope to integrate the divine experience that you have through grace being given if you don't make the commitment to put it into living practice by serving other people. So if you truly do sacred practice, that will align you constantly to your own deepest and best self. If you truly continually do shadow work, that will purify you so that you can become increasingly the humble instrument of divine love and wisdom. And if you really take the challenge of all the great teachers, from the Buddha to the Prophet to the Christ, all of them, to turn up and do something from your renewed and transformed awareness, then you will be able to integrate, and then you will be in the stream of love's transforming force. So over time, you become an embodied, divine human being, constantly in touch with the source and humbly giving of yourself in your life to everyone in mysterious and tender ways. I know the truth of these things because at 63, I'm a very, very different person to what I was 20 or 25 years ago. I hardly recognize that person. And that's not because I'm enlightened or special. It's because I was so desperate and so unhappy that I finally listened to these simple, pragmatic instructions that I'm giving you, giving everybody who's listening, and really realized that if I didn't knuckle down and hunker down and do the work daily, humbly, nuts or kill myself. So now, at 63, I can see the truth of these things, and I am so grateful.
And talk to me about the inner practice. I understand sacred activism as a way of bringing that awareness into the world. And talk to me about the inner practice, sacred practice, that folks can do on a regular basis to keep themselves aligned with this force that you're talking about, the love that you're talking about.
Well, I think that there are really 5 kinds of practice that we are called to do if we truly want to birth ourselves holistically as rounded, integrated, divine human beings. The first kind of practice is what I call cool practices. And cool practices are essential. They are the foundation of the path. And cool practices are fundamentally those practices that enable you to stay calm, stay grounded, stay breathing in whatever circumstance you find yourself. And of course, as the world goes more and more into this seemingly terminal death crisis, these are going to be absolutely the oxygen of survival. One cool practice that anybody can do, whatever they believe in, is a practice that I was taught by a Greek Orthodox monk years ago. And it's simply to, when you breathe in a golden light, the color of sunlight sparkling on the river, and allow that golden light to go down to the bottom of your toes, consciously feel it permeating your whole being, and allow it to go above your head and just break in a great cocoon around you. And then breathe out. And when you breathe out your anxiety, your gloom, your hysteria, your rage, whatever it is. And you'll find that if you do this for just a minute with real intention, your whole consciousness will shift and steady. It's amazing. Try it. The second kind of practice that everybody needs is what I call hot practices. The New Age has been so addicted to cool practices that it's become totally chilled out. So I imagine all those cool practices just sitting in front of the TV, and when they see Antarctica melting, they just, sip their Chardonnay and say, oh, Antarctica's melting. Or when they see Iraq fall apart in ISIS, it can be very dangerous if you only do the cool practices, because the divine is both peace and passionate becoming. So you need the hot practices that really keep your sacred heart juicy and passionate and wild and alive and open. And in a time like this, when we're all threatened by compassion fatigue because everything's falling apart and it seems so horrible everywhere, and everybody's tempted to just shut down and detach, it's so important to find practices that will keep your heart in a state of devotion to reality. For me, again, there's a very simple practice, and that is to say the name of God by whatever way you worship God, and to say it deeply, deeply, deeply in the core of the heart. If you have a mantra that you love, use it. If you love Christianity, just say the name of Jesus. If you love the Buddha, say Buddha, Buddha, Buddha. If you are in love with Islam, just say Allah in the heart. This is so simple. But in fact, in all of the great mystical traditions, it's known that saying the name of the divine that you love in the core of your heart connects you immediately with the entire cosmic presence of the divine. And again, you can hear this and say, oh, he's so enthusiastic. But the truth is that if you do it, if you really do it, you will discover for yourself. Because Rumi said, every time you say the name of God, it's like you take a rag and wipe the dirty mirror of your heart free of dust. So one day, the mirror of your heart will be so clear that reality will be reflected in it without any interfering distortion, and you will see nakedly and directly the purity of the real divine world that is actually always around us at all moments. And this experience has happened to me as it's happened to hundreds of thousands of seekers. And I know that when I'm depressed, when I'm lonely, when I'm battered by what's happening, when I feel that nobody's listening or caring a damn about anything, I just stop and I open my heart to the beloved and I say the name that I love, which is Allah, because I think that any name that Rumi loved is good enough for me, or Jesus, because I love Jesus. And immediately my heart both relaxes and starts to burn with its essential compassion. The third kind of practice that I really recommend to everybody is prayer. It's one of the most amazing things to me as I go around the world teaching sacred activism, that so many people, in fact most people, don't seem to know how to pray or who to pray to or why to pray, when there are so many studies that show the power of prayer, scientific studies, and when prayer has been at the core of all of the traditions. So again, choose a prayer, or better still, write a prayer from the depths of your own heart and use that prayer, memorize that prayer. I've just completed a book, it's published now, called Light the Flame. And over 30 years, I collected short prayers from all the great mystical traditions, and I put them together in a 365-day book. And it's one of the books that I'm most proud of giving to others, because these short prayers are prayers you can memorize. So you can memorize a prayer in the morning, really pray it for 5 or 10 minutes and really get into the depths of its atmosphere, and then carry it around in your day and turn to it in the odd spots of your day so that you can be infused by its power. And over time you'll find that through this practice you'll be able to cultivate a deep devotion to the divine, which in time will turn into a devotion to the whole of reality, because being devoted to God opens you to being devoted to everything, being tenderly loving towards everything. The fourth practice is body practice, my least favorite thing, because having had to run in the rain as an English schoolboy and jump up and down, I've avoided exercise with a passion that is almost pathological. But now, at 63, I'm realizing, of course, this is madness. And over these last 10 years, I've done a great deal of work on myself. I worked on a book called Heart Yoga with a great yogini, and what we did was to marry the traditional asanas with light mysticism. So yoga is a tremendously important way of opening your whole being to divine energies so that you can actually taste the divine energies within you. And so many people now are being woken up by yoga to this presence within, the beloved within. And that is a crucial way of keeping the body limber and strong so that it can stand the sometimes immense energies that come as you expand on the path. Sacred dance is another wonderful thing that I've done a lot of. I made a film with the great Banafsheh Sayad, who is the greatest sacred dancer in the world, called In the Fire of Grace. She's an incredibly beautiful Persian, unbelievable dancer, and we made this wild film about Rumi's path to love in a soft porn studio in Pasadena, which is probably the least likely place to ever make a film about Rumi. But it came out amazingly, and through her and through her teaching, and we've taught a lot together, I have really been able to release my body. You'll find if you have a sacred physical discipline, whenever you get constricted in your mind or sad in your heart, if you just turn to the body and allow it to open, simply the emotional or psychological or spiritual distress that you're in will go away. I've often gone to a yoga class absolutely out of my mind with pain and despair at what's going on and come out serene. It's the same world, but you're in another consciousness because you've allowed the innate truth of your body to steady you. And the fifth practice is, again, I believe, shadow work, because shadow work for me is a sacred practice. It's sacred because the divine will never be born in you completely until you have become completely awake to the dereliction of your human self, to the limitations of your human self. The God doesn't hand over the diamond of union except to the person who has truly understood the deep need for grace at every moment so as to be able to transform his or her narcissism and greed and cruelty and inherited madness. So those 5 practices anybody can do. They're not complicated. The more I live, the more I teach, the more I write, the more I understand that we have vastly overcomplicated the path. The path has many rigors and many ordeals, many stages and stations, and has its terrible moments and its disappointments and its defeats. But if you get a few really simple practices in each of these categories that work for you and use them when you need them, then over time you'll find, my God, you will change. you'll change greatly, deeply, and you'll become bearable to other people, which is such a wonderful thing.
Why is it, Andrew, that we resist the things that are most beneficial to us, that the ego fights off the very things it needs for its own liberation? What is that perverse resistance?
Well, I think it's actually quite simple, although the consequences are very complicated. As soon as you start to wake up and start to have those first amazing experiences of bliss or of light or of infinite presence, your ego realizes that its days are numbered. Because the presence that you're coming into, if you have any kind of authentic experience, reveals itself as so vast, so powerful, that your ego feels that it's nothing, which is the actual truth of it, that what we think of as ourself is a fiction. What we've created as our ego is actually a structure created around wounds and fantasies and conditioning. And the ego that has been so addicted to its perverse control gets secretly terrified and expresses that terror in resistance, in distraction, in saying to you, what's all this rubbish about saying the name of God when you're walking down the street? It doesn't work. Look, you tried it for 5 days and you're not enlightened. Give it up. Go back to sex, drugs, and rock and roll. That's the reason. Don't you think?
Fear. I do. I completely agree. It's fear of its own survival that makes
the ego and it's
fight off the light. And it's right to fear the light.
Yes, it's right to fear the light, except that if it was able to really trust, then something amazing would happen to the ego. You see, I don't think the ego ever disappears on the path, but the ego can be transformed. So instead of being the domineering psychotic tyrant that it is normally, it can become the loving servant of the truth. And that's what the ego in its essence really wants to be. But until you do the practice and until you do shadow work, you won't be able to cherish this essence in the ego enough to allow the ego to go through its transformation so that it can remain, but not as a despot, but as a loving servant. And in that loving servanthood, it will find what it's always wanted, which is meaning and purpose and peace.
Right. It sounds like, you could replace the word ego with mind, talking about mind being a wonderful servant but a terrible master.
Well, mind, yes, but it's also, the ego is constructed of course, one's mental formations, but so many of them are really prompted by emotional disturbance, too. So it's how you've been shaped by your parents, what you suffered in your youth, how you've been with your own sexuality. There are a lot of things that go into this complex lunatic that we call the ego.
Tell me, Andrew, what do you say to the person without faith? What do you say to the person who is who doesn't have a theological bone in his body, doesn't believe in God, hears the word divine and shrinks back from it? How do we communicate to a person like that who is so afraid of being taken advantage of or being gullible or putting their faith in something that isn't real? How would you address that?
Well, what I would like to say, which I never do, is, for God's sake, get over it as quickly as you can, because don't make the mistake of confusing the divine with the religions and their crazy fundamentalisms and dogmas and patriarchal distortions with the real essential presence. And plunge into reading the real mystics, like Rumi, like Teresa of Avila, like the Bhagavad Gita, because if you approach them with any kind of openness, you will be astounded at the way in which, beyond surface differences, they all agree and say so much the same thing, which must mean that they are all in contact with the same thing. But if that's rejected, and I understand why people would reject even that, I would say, look, you are aware of being conscious, and you must also be aware from your own inner experience that you've experienced moments of tremendous irrational joy, perhaps just sitting in a deck chair looking out at the sea, or great rapture suddenly being with a dear friend, or enormous passion which exploded you into strange, wild realms when you were making love, or great, great peace when you're listening to Bach. So you don't have to call that God, but what you do have to acknowledge is that what you normally think of as your consciousness is just a very small fraction of what your consciousness is capable of. So if you don't want to think about the divine, if you don't want to think about God, then cultivate a larger awareness. And slowly your consciousness will expand to give you more of these calming and expanding states which will make you a much happier person. And one very skillful way of doing this is to really undertake mindfulness practice or very simple forms of meditation. You don't have to believe in anything to do mindfulness practice, and over time it has amazing results. You don't have to believe in anything except the mysterious vastness of consciousness to really do meditation. Just sit and watch your thoughts, and slowly over time you become aware of a vast, quiet, silent, white spaciousness within you that is your real daily witness consciousness that will enable you to step back and have a gap between you and all reactions that you might have had before. And over time, you'll be amazed to discover what is actually living in you. And that will set you free and start you on a path of real inquiry, because once you've tasted that vast inner consciousness that is actually the true nature of consciousness, then you may very well be inspired by that experience to go deeper into divine inquiry. Does that sound like an intelligent answer to you?
Beautiful, and truly beautiful. And that faith really isn't the point. The point is the power to observe consciousness and this mysterious, magnificent experience of life.
Yes.
And see what kind of space that opens up in the mind, and see how that changes what we think is possible. Because so much of this doubt and cynicism comes from depression. It's a low-grade depression and a stunted sense of what's possible. So
absolutely, but it's also, I've met so many people, spiritual directees, and they said, I've never had a mystical experience, I've never had a spiritual experience. I said, okay, well, have you ever had a dream in which you woke up crying with joy? Well, that's a spiritual experience. Have you ever, when you're listening to Mozart, suddenly felt your mind expand and you heard something you've never heard before, something so beautiful that it pierced you? Yes, well, that's a spiritual experience. Have you ever felt sitting with a friend, there was a mysterious unity between you, that you were the same being? Well, that's a mystical experience. And you discover, of course, at the end of a conversation like that everybody has had these immense openings, but because we live in such an unsacred culture, a culture devoted to the fundamentalism of the bottom line and scientific fundamentalism, and because we see around us the religions behaving so childishly and sometimes savagely, people aren't encouraged to describe their experiences as initiatory. They just think, well, it came and went and that's it. No, it isn't. Mm-hmm. Those experiences, dreams of being in tender unity with a friend, of listening to music, of all those kinds of experiences are actually rays of the sun of the secret self within, invitations by that secret beloved to go deeper.
Exactly.
Don't you feel that?
Yes, I do, and it's seeing glimpses of the self through these experiences, that they're opening the door to what's there behind this sort of scrim of craziness and noise.
Yes.
And whatever does that is a mystical or a spiritual experience.
Yes, Rumi says, every joy you've ever felt is a ray from the invisible sun of love. And that means that when you're eating a peach and you're exhilarated, that's actually an exhilaration of the divine in you. when you're walking and you suddenly notice a rose that's so beautiful and your heart leaps, that is a kiss from the invisible sun. And once you begin to realize that, you realize that the one, the eternal one, that has manifested all of this staggering multiplicity out of itself is reaching out to you in every way possible. And then you feel accompanied and sustained. It's that shift that makes all the difference.
Oh, Andrew. Well, we began with Rumi, and I think this is a great place for us to close. But it's always wonderful to talk to you.
And wonderful to talk to you, and I'll talk to you anytime you want, baby.
Thank you, my
Shall
dear.
we have a Rumi poem to end with?
Let's do, please.
Let's do it. Let's go for this Rumi. I love this poem. Oh, my God. And this really gets to the core of what we're saying. Stay close, my heart, to the one who knows your ways. Come into the shade of the tree that always has fresh flowers. Don't stroll lazily through the bazaar of the perfume makers. Stay in the shop of the sugar seller. If you don't find true balance, anyone can deceive you. Anyone can trick out a thing of straw and make you take it for gold. Don't squat with a bowl before every boiling pot. In each pot on the fire you find very different things. Not all sugar canes have sugar. Not all abysses are peak. Not all eyes possess vision. Not every sea is full of pearls. Oh, nightingale, with your voice of dark honey, go on lamenting. Only your drunken ecstasy can pierce the rock's hard heart. Surrender yourself, and if you cannot be welcomed by the friend, know that you are rebelling inwardly like a thread that doesn't want to go through the needle's eye. The awakened heart is a lamp. Protect it by the hem of your robe. Hurry and get out of this wind, for the weather is bad. And when you've left this storm, you will come to a fountain, and you will find a friend there who will always nourish your soul. And with your soul always green, you grow into a tall tree, flowering always with sweet, light fruit, whose growth is interior.
Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for talking to the Seekers Forum.
My great joy and pleasure, and God bless you, and God bless everybody out there. In here, rather. Bless you, bless you, bless you.